A tale of two hearings. Welcome to Law and Society. Today I'm going to talk to you about Tom Homan's press conference in Minnesota and the Senate Homeland Security Committee's hearing that included AG Keith Ellison of Minnesota and other key immigration officials and federal officials to answer questions about Operation Metro Surge and the federal government's immigration policies. Two very different public hearings took place yesterday. Tom Homan held a press conference in Minnesota announcing that he had proposed and Donald had concurred that Operation Metro Surge would conclude. There will be significant drawdown this week and next week. A small footprint will remain to turn control over to the field office. Homan claimed that Minnesota officials were cooperating and that there had been a noticeable decrease in agitator activity. He repeated the term agitator multiple times, stating that their lawlessness and chaos needed to end because Homan didn't want any more bloodshed. Blood that was shed by DHS agents when they murdered two Minnesotans in broad daylight. Homan's tone remained oppressive as he announced the end of the federal siege of the Twin Cities. He preceded the announcement by reasserting that Trump's regime has a zero-tolerance policy if you put hands on ICE officers. However, as the videos show, Renee Good had her car turned away from the murdering agent and was on her way out of that confrontation, and Alex Preddy had his hands up while 6 ICE agents descended on him, pepper sprayed him, tackled him to the ground, and then shot him to death. Video evidence from multiple perspectives clearly show that neither Renee nor Alex ever put their hands on the federal agents who murdered them. Homan classified agitators as public safety threats and also national security threats. At no point did he call the people on the streets protesters, only agitators. He repeated previous talking points of ICE conducting their targeted operations based on reasonable suspicion, and that he didn't want local law enforcement to do ICE's job. He just wants them to do their law enforcement duties. However, Homan said nothing about how federal agents are aggressively conducting law enforcement operations that ICE has no power to conduct. At a separate hearing, at the Senate Homeland Security Committee hearing on ICE procedures, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison confirmed that the state officials were unable to help federal agents because of the sheer volume of federal agents had overwhelmed the state's capacity to assist the feds in any way. AG Ellison said Minnesota had been occupied by the federal government, with between 3,000 and 4,000 federal agents patrolling the streets. He compared what happened in Minnesota to British soldiers marching through Boston during the Boston Massacre. We haven't seen this level of scale in other cities. Single largest deployment of immigration officials in U.S. history, AG Ellison testified. Democratic Senator Hassan of New Hampshire, who had just returned from a visit to Greenland, said what is happening today is unacceptable. People around the globe, their children, are scared of the United States of America. Witnesses further testified that Operation Metro Surge had disrupted cooperation between Minnesota and the federal government that was ongoing long before Donald's regime flooded Minnesota with federal agents, who then went ahead and started racial profiling, roving patrols, pepper spraying peaceful protesters, and shooting them to death. Witnesses all hoped, as did the senators from both parties, that state and federal cooperation can be restored to the partnership they had before Operation Metro Surge. AG Ellison welcomed that cooperation and insisted that the massive surge of federal agents had disrupted that ongoing cooperation. He informed the committee that people across the political spectrum in Minnesota are disturbed by how federal agents have operated in Minnesota and the Twin Cities. In the middle of the hearing, Republican Senator Langford informed the committee and others in the room that Tom Homan had announced that Operation Metro Surge would end. Senator Kim, a Democrat from New Jersey, stated that the American people rejected ICE across the board, and the voice of the people was finally heard. He further lamented that despite the drawdown, the damage had been done. This echoed Governor Tim Walz's press conference after Homan's announcement of the end of federal occupation. Senator Rand Paul insisted that AG Ellison make public statements about cooperating with federal agents and assisting them where they need local law enforcement support. Senator Blumenthal expressed concern that the ICE DHS problem was much bigger than Minnesota. It was about an out-of-control agency that's imposing brutality and violence in neighborhoods across the country. On the matter of cooperation, Senator Blumenthal asks about Minnesota's access to evidence in the Renee Good and Alex Preddy murders and whether access has been denied. AG Ellison said that the state has been denied access to critical information like access to Renee Good's car, the guns, the shell casings in both the murders, and denied critical information to investigate the murders. This lack of access brings up evidentiary concerns like chain of custody and preservation of the integrity of the evidence that is critical to any investigation and prosecution. Senator Blumenthal expressed concern that what Donald's regime was doing with these murders could be seen as a cover-up. A.G. Ellison agreed and said many Minnesotans were thinking that. Federal agents won't be investigating Renee Good's murder, A.G. Ellison reminded the committee. Senator Blumenthal then chided the federal government and said that the failure to investigate Renee Good's murder and investigating her family instead was abhorrent. Speaking of abhorrent, some Republican senators decided that they'd turn up the theatrics and attack Keith Ellison. Senators Johnson and Moreno said they were disgusted by A.G. Ellison. Moreno called him low caliber, and Johnson blamed A.G. Ellison for the murders of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, saying that Ellison and other state officials had encouraged the tragedy that happened. Senators Hawley and Moody both attacked A.G. Ellison over fraud claims against Minnesota. Moody blamed Governor Tim Walz for some massive scam against the American people, and Hawley was foaming from his mouth by the end of his tirade where he accused A.G. Ellison of taking bribes, all without a morsel of evidence to prove it. A.G. Ellison pushed back as much as he could and called out the baseless accusations every chance he got. A.G. Ellison told Hawley that he was lying and that he should be ashamed for misrepresentation. Hawley replied that Ellison should be imprisoned. All in all, Republicans wanted to put on a show for an audience of one, despite the fact that the committee chairman, Republican Rand Paul, remained composed and stuck to the facts and video evidence. Republicans tried to derail the objective of the hearing, which was immigration procedures and Operation Metro Surge, to talk about fraud and accuse Ellison and Minnesota officials of scamming the American public. However, they presented no evidence to prove such fraud. Democrats in the committee and Chairman Rand Paul kept bringing the hearing back to its purpose and find ways to solve the problems. The second panel of CBP and ICE leaders also testified in the second half of the hearing that yelling at federal agents is not illegal or cause for escalation. They also conceded that assaulting Alex Preddy, like those officers did, was not de-escalatory. Rand Paul insisted that something had to be done and perpetrators had to be held accountable for the murders in Minneapolis. ICE and CBP leaders testified that investigations were ongoing and they would inform the public when the time comes, presumably when they either bring charges against the murderers or choose to not hold them accountable on account of some form of immunity. These were big and important hearings that took place nearly back to back from Minneapolis to Washington, D.C. Things are beginning to pick up and we should all pay attention. Where will ICE go next? Will they change their tactics? Do protesters have to fear for their lives when peacefully protesting? And if so, isn't that an infringement on our right to peaceful protest? Isn't it intimidating peaceful protesters and assaulting them with tear gas and other chemical irritants an infringement of their rights? Many questions remain, but one thing is certain. The federal government is not winning the war in the court of public opinion, and soon some federal agents may have to face courts of law for their brutal and murderous actions. Donald's regime will resist and try to block justice, and that is why we must remain loud and clear about what we the people will accept and that we will never give up our rights and freedoms bestowed on us by our Constitution. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you soon.